It is the 55th anniversary of the moon landing, or if you're Jay Weidner on the other line getting ready to come talk to us, you might say to yourself, not so fast. Don't know if it is. But it's also a full moon tonight, and so Jay's going to come on, and he's going to talk about the moon landing. And this is crazy, but he ties it together very, very well. Not only, you may have heard the conspiracy theory that we didn't go. You may have heard that it was filmed all on a soundstage by acclaimed director Stanley Kubrick. But did you know that his movie, The Shining, based on the Stephen King book, is like a full-on confessional littered with Easter eggs, and he will prove the whole thing, and I can't wait to get to him. So instead of just talking about nonsense, let's take our break, and we're going to come back, and we're going to get to Jay Weidner right after this on Coast to Coast AM. Rich Berra, Coast to Coast. Let's bring in Jay Weidner, renowned filmmaker, author, and scholar. For me, he is like the Plato of conspiracy theory artists. I mean, he has come up with stuff that I've never heard before, and I love this guy from the first moment that I talked to him in person on the phone here earlier this week. Welcome to the show, Jay. It is great to have you on Coast to Coast AM. We got a lot to get into tonight.
Hey, well, thanks for having me.
Let's start with the moon landing 55th anniversary today, and full moon. And I watched your film, your documentary on the moon landing, and your really intriguing look at the film. And I think one of the big takeaways is you're not saying nobody went to the moon. You're just saying the video that we're seeing is probably from Stanley Kubrick. Am I right there?
Yeah, I'm not saying that we didn't go to the moon. I think we probably did, probably many times. But I'm just saying that what we saw was a kind of a government-issued version of the moon landing.
Okay, so take us back to why they would feel like they needed one of those and how Stanley Kubrick would be involved in that.
Well, that's a very interesting story. So that goes back to James Forrestal, who was the very first defense secretary of the United States, was also the mentor to JFK. And he was in MJ-12 and was very familiar with what the Germans had been making in World War II in Germany as far as flying saucers. And I think Kennedy, when he was elected president, understood that we had much higher technology than they were letting on, and he really used his call for NASA to go to the moon by the end of the 1960s as a kind of a trick to get NASA to release this high technology, this gravitic technology, electrogravitic technology that was basically could get them to the moon in like an hour and a half. But they didn't want to do that, and so they faked the footage and to make it look like we got to the moon with, rocketry, which, of course, we cannot do, and we haven't done since. We should also mention, of course, that NASA has destroyed all of the videotape and that we took of the moon landings. They're all gone. There's no more.
Why would you destroy that if you're NASA? Why would you destroy the original tape or the satellite transmission or whatever that was? What would be the reason for that?
Well, what they say, which is kind of unbelievable, is that they were running out of money and they needed to reuse the videotapes.
That makes no sense at all, does it?
No. No, it
okay.
Doesn't.
I want to back up just a little bit before we start going down this path, because I want to give people a little bit of your background, because this is going to play into, we have you for 3 hours. We got a lot to unpack here, because we're going to talk about this, and we're going to talk about JFK, and we're even going to talk about what happened last week, because I know you have some thoughts on that too. So you have sort of a unique perspective as a filmmaker to what you're seeing when you look at what was shot for the moon stuff. And I'll tell you this right now, the things that you watch now, they really don't hold up. Like, as far as being what it says it is, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense of what we're looking at. So give people a little bit about what you've done in the movies.
Yeah, so I have an extensive background in what we call real world effects or in camera effects, which are not digital. They're in camera. And so I went and looked at the Apollo footage in probably about 25 years ago. I did extensive research, going to NASA facilities, looking at the footage, looking at the photographs, and always felt that there was something wrong, but not ever able to figure out what was going on. And then about 16 years ago, I got a DVD version of 2001 Space Odyssey, and I began watching it. And I knew that Kubrick had used an effect called front screen projection to achieve the ape scenes and the scenes with the astronauts on the moon. And,
by the way, when you were explaining that in the documentary, I feel like a version of that has come back now that they use on some of the Star Wars movies, where it's sort of like they use gamification to make the background, but they have a little bit of a set, and then there's a little bit of a break, but the background that looks like it can even move, everything's in focus, but it's digitally being done by basically gamers in the background. And this was sort of the first version of that, it sounds like, that Stanley Kubrick was using when he was making the masterpiece that is 2001 Space Odyssey.
Wow, that's really a good analysis. Exactly right. And today they are using this kind of technique all the time in movies. And what it basically is there's a screen behind the actors, and then what Kubrick did and what they're doing today, which was so brilliant, is they're using a system that allows all of the light to be projected onto the background, and then that makes it look like the background and the foreground are the same lighting, and therefore you cannot tell what's background and foreground become one. And Kubrick actually perfected this, especially in the beginning scene of 2001 with the apes, but even later with the astronauts on the moon. And this was the most convincing, cinematic trick of all time. And it convinced us that Kubrick was actually filming, in a desert somewhere, with apes. It wasn't true at all. Everything was being done on a soundstage
with
and
people
also
in ape costumes.
With the Apollo footage. Now, this doesn't mean they didn't go to the moon.
Right. This just means that what you're seeing
wasn't real.
What you're seeing wasn't real. And so when you start tying this together, I mean, you can be as much of a skeptic as you want, but what you kind of tell here, I'm going to dumb it down, and then you can do the inside baseball part. What I see is you can definitely see where the set ends, like a line on the horizon, and then you can see where the background begins, especially when you look at a high-res version of it, and you start kind of getting used to what the trick is. You can sort of see the line on the horizon in every moonshot, and it's not like anybody moves out of the frame. They don't go beyond into the screen or into the atmosphere. It's everything stops in front of that. Everything moves horizontally along that line, right?
Yeah, it's called the moon landing community, I guess. It's called the cube horizontal, and it's a horizontal line that appears in every image, whether it's video or photography. Somewhere right behind the astronauts, you can see a horizontal line, which, if you look, you can see that the stuff on the bottom side of the line is in one kind of texture, and the stuff on the other side of the line, the dirt, the rocks, etc., are on the other side of the line. And you can clearly see the delineation between the two, and there's really no other way to explain this except that the stage line and the projection line are that line. And so it's become very problematic for everyone to understand at NASA because everyone can see it. And it's everywhere. It's on the videos, it's on the stills, and it's in every single image.
And it looks like there's one type of terrain where the astronauts are standing, and then where you have the imaginary line, it's all like basically smooth terrain. It's totally different, even though it's just in the background.
Yeah, and this is what would happen if you had front screen projection. You would have the screen behind the astronauts where the background is being projected, and then you'd have the texture of the set itself. Now, there's a scientist in Ukraine who looked at Apollo images, and he began to use parallax, which is a technique where you can separate the images and see how far back the background is. And he concluded that using parallax, the screen was about 60 feet behind the astronauts.
To your knowledge, back in 55 years ago, would they be able to transmit a video signal? I'm sure they could do radio, right? Because they had transmitters. But could they really do video in real time, or even an hour behind? Could they do that?
It doesn't seem likely now. The other thing that's a problem is that they're using Ektachrome film in their cameras, and their cameras were built by Hasselblad, and Hasselblad has admitted that they never altered their cameras for X-rays or gamma rays in outer space. So the cameras were basically unprotected, and you can't even take film through an airport X-ray device without it being destroyed. So it seems rather dubious that you could even take a photograph on the moon with all the X-rays and the gamma rays and all the radiation that's pouring down on the moon, because the moon isn't protected by clouds or anything. It's there's no atmosphere, so it's dubious that it could even happen. Let alone put a video camera on the surface of the moon with 250-degree temperatures, blazing sunlight, burning out all your systems. It just doesn't. It's just
that makes sense. You can't even leave your iPhone in your car right now in this day and age and have it work very well if the sun hits it. So that is an interesting thing. And do you find Apollo 11? I know we've talked about that, but do you find a similar, as you say, film with the other Apollo missions as well? Does it kind of look the same?
Well, the thing is that here's the thing. So if you watch let's say a television series like The Walking Dead, you'll watch it from the beginning to the end. You'll notice that at the beginning of the series, the scenes are not as populated with people. There's not as much money being spent on the production. But as the production goes along, say by the third, fourth, or fifth season, now there's lots of extras and the sets are much more elaborate and everything, which is because the series is making money and they can afford to extrapolate and make it bigger. And that's exactly what you see with the Apollo program. It starts out that you really can't see anything in the background. There's no hills or mountains. It's just a black background. But by Apollo 15 and 16, and especially 17, the sets have become much more elaborate.
When they're cruising on the little beach rover that's jumping up and down, it does look like
it's leaves the confines of the set, by the way. If you actually watch it rolling around, it doesn't go very far. And so, and the thing is that what I believe was going on here is that they had high-tech equipment that could get to the moon very quickly, which they developed in the 1950s through mostly U.S. Navy research, and they didn't want anyone to see it, and so they kind of made this elaborate fake to hide the fact that we had much higher technology, and we didn't want the Russians to find it. And
well, that's a different tech.
Exactly.
So you do a little low-tech version of what actually happened there, and then you hide all the things that you've been doing up there. So now that gets into a little bit of what Richard Hoagland had been saying on Art Bell's show, and even in George Norrie's show, that the black background is actually, when you enhance it, you can see rebar and glass structures and all that. Was he just seeing the projection of the background, and was he just seeing the whatever's holding up the projector? What was he looking at?
Well, so what they did was in 2001: A Space Odyssey, he used this thing called it was built. It was like thousands of little glass beads. It was a screen, and it was a perfect projection screen because it projected almost 100% of the light back at the camera. And this is the front screen projection system. And so when they used it on Apollo, it sometimes caused refractions in the sky as one of the beads would be off tilt and would cause a reflection back of rainbow colors. And that's what Hoagland is seeing, is the front screen projection system having a flaw.
Mm. So he's not wrong that it's not right. Just what he saw was the Kubrick effect, where the camera wasn't just hitting that part of it just right. So it was an anomaly.
Yeah, actually, if you look in the ape scenes or the moon scenes in 2001: A Space Odyssey, you will see the same exact effect. If you slow down the film and just slightly, change the contrast and everything, you will see this rainbow effect that happens because the glass beads are reflecting back the light shining in on them.
So was 2001: A Space Odyssey for Stanley Kubrick and the moon shooting that thing, those scenes, were they happening around the same time? So was NASA involved in that movie?
NASA. They called Kubrick's production NASA East, and many of the top heads of NASA were going to the set of 2001 for unknown reasons and seeing what was going on. It should also be noted that in 1965, the Department of Information, which is probably a CIA cutout, was looking for famous film directors to use on an unknown project. And one of those film directors, of the 5 film directors that we were looking for, which were all famous film directors, one of them was Stanley Kubrick. And they pointed out that Stanley Kubrick was, a high priority project for this whatever project they were looking for. So this was 1965, which would be right when they would want to be looking for someone to help them with this whole project.
So then once he makes this movie, is it sort of a deal with the devil, or does it give him the freedom to do whatever he wants as far as movies go, to make 2001: A Space Odyssey and shoot the moon with your budget and say whatever you want to say?
I would say a little of both. He made a deal with the devil, which allowed him to make a movie, or any movie that he wanted to make for the rest of his life. But, he famously once said that you should never deal with people who are high up in power. They're very dangerous. And you have to wonder why he said that, because, it's clearly obvious that, he was working with people high up in power. And, it should be noted that as great a movie as 2001: A Space Odyssey is, and it is a great movie, many people were involved in that production, including naval intelligence, the CIA, all the aerospace companies. People don't realize that although it's a great movie, it was also an advertisement for this kind of military-industrial complex that they wanted to build into the future.
When we come back, I want to get into The Shining, Stanley Kubrick's movie, and how it's a confession for him as having been the director of the videos that you see of the moon landing. We're back with Jay Weidner next when we return on Coast to Coast AM. We are so lucky tonight to have Jay Weidner, filmmaker, talking about the moon landing. And it's interesting, his take. Let's pull Jay up here, so I want to get his take on this. When we talk about the fake moon landing conspiracy, none of the usual suspects, as far as why it doesn't look real, comes up when Jay talks about it, because it's not like he's saying there are rocks that have letters on them because they're part of a set, and he's not talking about necessarily how they're not moving naturally. He's talking about the fact that the way it's shot, none of it would be totally in focus the way it is that far back unless they somehow were using a projection screen to do it. And his argument is that director Stanley Kubrick, around the time he was filming 2001: A Space Odyssey, got a big old budget from the government to say, make this look good. And Jay's not saying nobody ever went to the moon. He suspects they did. He's just saying the stuff that you see, the films that have been destroyed now, just aren't the real thing. So then it makes me wonder, when you start tying in The Shining, Jay, what do you think made Stanley Kubrick choose The Shining as his confessional, his Easter egg confessional?
Well, I think that he had come off a kind of a loser film with Barry Lyndon, which didn't make any money, and they showed him an early version of Stephen King's book, The Shining, before it was published, and kind of said, hey, we'd like you to kind of do this film if you'd like. And he read the book, and I believe that he thought, wow, this is a perfect vehicle for me to make it look like I'm making a horror film, but really I'm going to make a film that tells another story. And
it's interesting.
Told, of course, in the movie Room 237 by Rodney Asher, a great documentary about different people have different ideas of what The Shining really is. And so I'm in that movie, and I postulate that, of course, every time that Kubrick deviates from the Stephen King novel, he's actually telling you, or his confession, that he did the moon landing. And by the way, I've talked to a mutual friend who knows Stephen King, and Stephen King actually thinks that I'm right and thinks that my theory is completely correct.
Well, there's some credit. Okay, so that's a good setup for when we come back. I want to break down all the things that you bring up that are sort of deviations from The Shining, because I remember reading the book as a kid and then seeing the movie and not thinking that it was very similar in a lot of the big points, and those big points are the nods to the moon landing, which is so out there. So we are down officially. We have taken the pill. We are down the rabbit hole, and we'll go further with Jay Weidner next when we come back on Coast to Coast AM. I'm Rich Berra. This is Coast to Coast AM. Our guest, Jay Weidner, filmmaker, and as I said, the Play-Doh of conspiracy theories. And we were talking about that he believes that the moon landings happened at some point, but the video you see, completely done by Stanley Kubrick back in the 1960s, and maybe even subsequent missions as he got a bigger budget and some better special effects. And then we started talking about The Shining and how that was a confession of sorts from Stanley Kubrick. And one of the things that struck me when I was watching the documentary is when they first go to the hotel and Jack Nicholson is getting his assignment to watch the hotel. The guy at the other end of the desk kind of looks like Kennedy. You want to speak to that a little bit?
Well, yeah. So when a lot of people don't realize that when Spartacus, Stanley Kubrick's film, was released in 1960, a lot of people were criticizing it from the right wing for being a left-wing film. And so it was kind of, when it started out, Spartacus was kind of wavering in its support. And then Kennedy went to see Spartacus, and then he came out and said, no, Spartacus is a great film, and made Spartacus one of Kubrick's biggest hits. And so Kubrick kind of owed Kennedy a lot, but I think that Kennedy also was discussing, how to do things with Kubrick. We know that Kubrick was recruited by the Department of Information early in the 1960s to do some kind of unknown work. The thing is that in 1963, 1964, it was kind of well known in the filmmaking community that Kubrick was the next dude. His film Paths of Glory, Lolita, Spartacus, Dr. Strangelove, they were, in the film community, they were like, wow, this is the guy. And the U.S. government noticed it and brought him in. And there's no doubt about it. He's always had really deep relations with the military-industrial complex. Arthur C. Clarke was his co-writer in 2001, and he was way deep into the whole military-industrial complex. And Kubrick was just the perfect guy to recruit to do this kind of covert work. His work in Dr. Strangelove with the B-52 flying over Siberia, which was done with a model, wasn't real at all. The Air Force saw that and went, oh, my God, this guy is like, he can make anything happen. And
that must have looked good on a big screen. Like when I watch it on your documentary, it looks a little, it needs some work now, but I bet when you saw it on a big screen back in the day, it probably looked very impressive.
Oh, it did. And yes, of course, it doesn't look anywhere near what they can do nowadays. But this is way before digital or any kind of computer effects were formed. He was doing this all with in-camera effects. And as a filmmaker, I can tell you what he was achieving was incredible at his day and age. And no one else was anywhere near the effects that he was achieving in both Dr. Strangelove and 2001: A Space Odyssey. So what I'm contending is that 2001: A Space Odyssey was the template for him to learn how to do it. And then later he did it in like 1969 and 70, just really because they didn't want the Soviet Union to understand what kind of technology we had. It wasn't like a gigantic cover-up to hide things in a way that a lot of the conspiracy theorists think. It's really just the idea that you don't really want your enemy to see what you've got. It's the Sun Tzu, art of war kind of thing.
So then why confess it in The Shining then? If he basically pulled it off, the secret filmmaking masterpiece that he did, why confess to it, or why give those Easter eggs in The Shining? And let's cover some of those here before we go to break, because when we come back, we got to get into the whole JFK thing, because I don't want to miss that either. Your new documentary. It just seemed like this is a good time on the anniversary to start with the moon. So let's talk about the room number that you shouldn't go in, and what the significance of that is.
Yeah, so in the movie, Danny, the boy, is warned by Halloran, who is the cook at The Shining at the Overlook Hotel, to not go into room 237. And he is about an hour into the film. Danny is playing with his toy trucks in the hallway, in one of the hallways of the Overlook Hotel, and the whole entire geometry of where he's playing on the carpet is very similar to the launch pad 39A, where the Apollo 11 was launched, and Danny is wearing a sweater that says Apollo 11 with a rocket that's taking off.
Oh, yeah, in the beginning of the movie, too, you're talking about how everybody's kind of dressed in red, white, and blue, which you don't even really notice.
Yeah, at the very first time that you meet Danny and Wendy in The Shining, they're both dressed in red, white, and blue, and Wendy is reading Catcher in the Rye, which was written by deep intelligence officer J.D. Salinger, who actually debriefed the Nazis at the end of World War II. So, you're like wondering, what is Stanley trying to tell you here? And I think he's trying to tell you that the Overlook Hotel is actually America, and that it is part of this scheme to create the moon landing. And Stanley is telling you it over and over. So every time he deviates from the book, he's telling you his confession. So in the book, the room is 217, but in the movie, it's room 237. And it was well known at the time, and you can look it up, that the scientific analysis of the distance of the moon from the Earth in 1969 or 1968, when he was making 2001, was 237,000 miles. And so Kubrick changed that.
You pick up on a lot of stuff. What about the part of the movie that I think in your documentary you spell this out pretty well? The all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Yeah,
so Jack is writing a book. That's the whole reason he came to the Overlook to spend the winter there. He wants to write the great American novel. And he tells Wendy, don't interrupt me when I'm writing my book. But Wendy's really curious, so Wendy goes into his room and picks up his novel that he's writing and realizes that Jack's writing the same sentence over and over. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. And then you look and you realize that the all has the letters LL looking exactly like the numbers 1-1. And then you realize it's saying A11 or Apollo 11 work makes Jack a dull boy. And Jack is clearly portraying in the movie Stanley Kubrick. He even looks like Stanley Kubrick. He, just as Stanley was a nice, clean-cut guy when he started making 2001: A Space Odyssey, by the end, he had a beard that was unkempt, his clothes were dirty, he looked exhausted, and that's exactly what happens to Jack Nicholson throughout the movie of The Shining. He starts out all nice and clean and everything, but by the end of the movie, he's just, completely unkempt. And this is him portraying Stanley Kubrick.
Do you know, did Stephen King like that version of the movie?
Stephen King absolutely hated The Shining and was actually paid $1 million by Warner Brothers to stop criticizing the movie. In the movie, so in the book, The Shining, Jack, the lead character, has a red Volkswagen.
Yes.
And in the movie, Jack, played by Jack Nicholson, has a yellow Volkswagen. But when Halloran, the cook, in the movie, is trying to get to the Overlook, he passes a very terrible car accident on the road in Denver, and the car accident consists of a giant semi crushing a red Volkswagen. And it's clearly Stanley Kubrick telling Stephen King that I crushed your vehicle and I've repossessed it.
Wow.
It must have pissed off Stephen King.
What do you think what's the most significant scene if people want to be like, oh, there it is? Do you think it's I was thinking it might be the twins, but you might have a different take on this. The Gemini twins. What is your take on that? And what do you think the most important confessional scene in that movie is?
I think the most important scene is when Wendy comes in, Shelley Duvall comes in, and she reads the book and realizes that Jack's not writing a book. He's just writing the same sentence over and over. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. And then she tells Jack that she wants to leave the Overlook, that, they're in danger. And Jack looks at her and confronts her on that famous staircase scene and says, do you have any idea what a contract means? Do you have any idea what my employers would do to me if I didn't fulfill my contract? And I think that that's Stanley talking to his wife.
Because he couldn't really tell anybody what he did, right? But do you think he did confess to anybody?
I do. I believe that he confessed to someone who was actually probably killed because they knew that Stanley had confessed. And, I'm not alone in this, by the way. There's a movie called Wag the Dog, which was made, many years after the moon landing, in which Dustin Hoffman plays a movie director named Stanley, who's invited by the CIA, played by Robert De Niro, to do action with fake movie action. And at the end of the movie, Dustin Hoffman's running around saying, "This is my best work. This is my best work." And then he dies. And so I believe that Hollywood is perfectly aware of what I'm saying.
And it's not like he stopped making movies at that point. He kind of got into some other weird stuff. I don't know much about when Eyes Wide Shut came out. It was just the freakiest thing I've ever seen. But then you get another 10 years later, and he's basically sharing the story of Epstein Island. Am I wrong? Or are groups like that?
No, you are. You're right. In fact, this is not only the 55th anniversary of the moon landing, but it's the 25th anniversary of Eyes Wide Shut, which just came out 25 years ago this week. And it's also the 25th anniversary of the death of Stanley Kubrick. So it's a lot of, and also Stanley Kubrick's birthday is in 6 days from now, on the 26th of July. So there's a lot of anniversaries here. So yeah, Kubrick released Eyes Wide Shut on the 30th anniversary of the Apollo 11 launching on July 16th, 1969. So in 1999, on July 16th, that's the date that Eyes Wide Shut was released, with its very freaky story of the elites having orgies and crazy parties, and Tom Cruise being completely bewildered by what's going on around him. And it's a very interesting film. And so we can see over and over that Kubrick is trying to bring you to notice that he was involved in the moon landing. And I'll just say this, right after Kubrick's Odyssey, my film about Kubrick's confession in The Shining, I was notified by a person close to Christopher Nolan that Christopher Nolan, the film director, was really into my work, and that his next film was going to be an homage to Stanley Kubrick. And sure enough, Interstellar came out, and it was a complete, homage to Kubrick, including mentioning that the moon landings were fake.
Oh, that's right. Unbelievable. Yep. Okay, well, we need to take a quick break, but when we come back, let's dig into JFKX, the new film by Jay Weidner, where he digs into who killed Kennedy. It is fascinating, and I tell you, it is a take that you have not heard before. Coming up next on Coast to Coast AM. Well, as long as I've listened to Coast through all the years with Art Bell and George Norrie, it feels like the two conspiracy theories that send you down the conspiracy path are, did we actually land on the moon, and who really killed JFK? And we got to get into both of those. In fact, this is the 55th anniversary of the lunar landing. Today is, and it's a full moon, which is cool. Thank you, REM, for that soundtrack there. And I was just reading this week a few things about the moon. First of all, NASA's found a bunch of caves on the moon. Not just one, but they think that there might be hundreds of caves. And, if we start, sending people up there to make that a base to go somewhere deeper, like Mars or something like that, and the event of a solar storm or something like that, any kind of thing, we could put people down there and keep them safe, which is interesting. But then the next day, I saw that they scrubbed the idea of going to the moon with people or sending rockets there for now anyway. So I don't know. There's a lot going on with the moon and the same old questions. And you heard Jay Weidner talking about, he's not saying we didn't go to the moon. He thinks we did. There's plenty of rocks. There's plenty of this. But the images that you see are totally, totally manufactured, the video that you see. And wait till you hear what he has to say about JFK. I've never heard this take before. Of all the conspiracies, we're going to dig in. We're going to dig in deep, and we'll take your calls on it too. And that is coming up next on Coast to Coast AM. Rich Berra here, Coast to Coast AM. Can't wait to get into this with Jay Weidner. His new documentary is called JFKX. And I want to kind of go back, take me back, Jay, to there's some stuff in here that I didn't know about. You kind of start off the documentary with all the usual suspects. You start off with, who was upset with JFK, and you talk about the CIA, and you talk about the mob. But what I guess I didn't know is even back then, when this first happened, there was a little bit of fog of information that people weren't necessarily believing what they were hearing right away, right? I mean, it started people asking questions from the jump, which I don't think I realized until I watched your documentary.
Yeah, I mean, there was all sorts of crazy, weird information that was being put out, including a complete description of Oswald, the assassin of JFK, supposedly, almost from the beginning, including a description of his rifle that he used. There was all sorts of just pre-scripted things that happened in the assassination that really make you wonder.
So let's go back to that. So you talk about that day when they arrive. Kennedy was very popular amongst the people. Him and his wife arrive at Fort Worth, and there's thousands of people outside. And I believe there's news cameras there, right? At that, because that footage looks pretty professional.
Yeah. So what happened is that on November 22nd, Jackie and Jack Kennedy, JFK, arrived in Fort Worth, and they were met literally. It was like the Beatles arriving in New York City the first time. Literally thousands and thousands of people at the airport to meet them. It's hard to understand now what kind of rock stars that JFK and his wife really were. At the time, I was a young kid at the time, and I remember it, and they really were, worshipped, sort of like Prince Di or the Beatles. And then they went to Dallas after their meetings in Fort Worth, and again, when they arrived in Dallas, there were thousands and thousands of people cheering them. And then their drive from the Dallas airport to Dealey Plaza, again,
where the parade is,
it was just incredible. In fact, I don't think any president since Kennedy has ever been able to garner that kind of crowds, except for maybe our current Trump. So anyway, he finally gets to Dealey Plaza, and then something really strange happens. This is the center of all the action. It's downtown Dallas. It's noontime. It's a sunny, beautiful day, and all of a sudden the crowds all thin out.
And not only that, there's no news cameras covering the parade on the parade route. So in Dallas, you said at the time there were three. There was ABC, NBC, and CBS. And nobody decided to send out any cameras to cover the president being in a parade at Dealey Plaza that afternoon. I know that's weird, but why does that strike you as strange?
Well, I worked in a newsroom years ago, and I know how news work, and I'm probably sure you also know how newsrooms work. And if you were going to have the president and his beautiful wife coming through your downtown area, you would definitely send a crew with a 60-millimeter camera to get it, if for nothing else, just to have it in your archives, because you could sell that film over and over again as archival footage. So it would be worth a lot of money for like years into the future. So everyone would be going there. All three networks in Dallas would be going to film Kennedy. There's no doubt about it as a former newsman, but I can tell you that they didn't. We don't have any footage. We only have the footage from Abraham Zapruder, who ran a dress shop nearby, who just happened to bring his 8-millimeter movie camera to the place to film the Kennedys, and got this famous Zapruder film. So,
and do you think nobody was counting?
Anomaly that the three networks that in Dallas at that time did not send any news crews to film the president. But, however, I show in the documentary, they did send crews. We see crews running around after the assassination, filming people talking about what they saw, and everything, but they didn't point their camera at the president as he went by at all, ever, even once.
Now, very bizarre, but you have the Zapruder film, and without that, do you think the Warren Commission or any of the other investigations, we would have just been listening to the story and maybe nobody would have questioned it, or all the stuff in between just makes you answer more or ask more questions?
Hello? Hello?
Oh, did we? Yeah, I'm there. You still there?
Okay, we lost you there for a second.
Okay, well, that was a kind of a jumbled question anyway, so let me try that again. If it weren't for the Zapruder film, do you think we'd be asking the same conspiratorial questions?
Well, what I think is that what the most brilliant part of my film JFKX is that me and my fellow filmmaker, Ryder Lee, we asked ourselves a question. We said, okay, we know that they have this kind of software which can take older films, like films from World War I or even earlier, 1920s, and they can transform them into looking like they were shot on 4K cameras, yesterday. And so he said, what would happen if we took the crummy 8mm Zapruder film and ran it through that same software and really enhanced the film so we could really see it? What would happen? And that's what we did. And when you look, you see that there's no one reacts to the gunshots going off.
Would those rifles have been really, really loud? Or that rifle would have been like, if you hear it pop, would you have a jerk reaction, or does it sound like what you hear currently in the Trump video, where it's like almost like a tick? What would it have sounded like?
Well, a .30 caliber would be very, very loud, and in a place with a lot of buildings, it would echo and reverberate in a way that would be actually very scary. And no one reacts in the Zapruder film to any guns going off. Not the bystanders, not the people in the car. It's all very strange. Many researchers have pointed this out over the years, how no one really responds to it. You have to understand that whether you take the government's position that Oswald fired from the Texas Book Depository, or whether a lone gunman fired from the grassy knoll, either way, you're talking about 40, 50 yards away from Kennedy, and a gun being fired 40 or 50 yards away from Kennedy is going to be very, very loud, and it's going to cause people to duck. It's almost unbelievable that Zapruder himself didn't duck because the bullets are flying right past his head, but he keeps his camera steady and going, never missing a beat. So we have to ask ourselves the question, if you look at, say, the recent Trump attempted assassination, you can see that when the bullets start flying, everybody ducks, or almost everybody ducks.
Almost everybody, except for that guy that everybody thinks is JFK Jr. in disguise. But we'll get to that in a minute. That's a very strange thing. But yes, I was wondering, like, that .30 caliber is pretty loud. So then, as you enhance this film, Lord Peter Jackson style, and get it up into 4K-ish type territory, you as a former filmmaker, and you as a man who has watched every aspect of every film, what do you notice that seems like it's out of place, that doesn't match up with either the Warren Commission or any other conspiracy theory?
Okay, so first off, there's certain effects that they use in films that no one in 1963 actually understood. So even if they were watching the film, they wouldn't know what they were watching because they didn't know the effects that were being used in the film. So what we have here is this thing where someone somewhere, and I'm not going to argue who it is, was firing a .30 caliber rifle at the president, yet no one actually reacts to the sounds of the gun going off, and no one is shot, or no bystanders are shot or anything. And so what we have here is like this curious conundrum of what is really going on. And once we take into the idea that Kennedy was under severe pressure at the time from many, many groups, then we begin to understand what's really going on. So what happened here, I'm going to try to be as quick as I can, is that after World War II, the CIA was created. And it was created to be like the central place where all the intelligence would go through. The problem is that the U.S. Navy, Naval Intelligence, had been the premier intelligence agency up to that time. And they did not like the fact that they had to succumb to the newly created CIA. And so Kennedy, who was Naval Intelligence, and also a protege of James Forrestal, who was also Naval Intelligence, began wondering what the CIA was really doing. And so in 1960, Naval Intelligence installed two candidates to run for president. One was Richard Nixon, who was Naval Intelligence, and the other one was JFK, who was Naval Intelligence. So they couldn't lose that election. And so when JFK was elected, barely elected, he began looking into what was going on with his brother, the Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy. And as they looked into what was going on, they realized that there was an unholy alliance between the mafia and the CIA. The CIA was using the mob to assassinate people and things like that. And it was like really an unnerving thing. And so Kennedy began, Robert Kennedy, his brother, began having these mobsters come up before Congress and talk about what they were doing. And the mob had been completely subdued, not talked about up until this time, and it was a real shock to the American people. And then in late 1963, October, it came out that an FBI informant had recorded a mobster saying that they were going to take out Kennedy.
And you have that in your documentary, right? That
because of his investigations into the mob.
That audio.
At that point, I believe the Naval Intelligence, in order to protect their asset in the White House, began an operation to protect Kennedy and his family from a mob-style hit. And that's what the movie is about.
So in the movie, you actually play some of that audio of the FBI informant, and with pretty chilling accuracy, they describe the scene. Yes, you're still on. Did you lose us?
Here?
Jay? Yeah, I'm here. Are you here?
Okay. Did you get that?
Yes. Yeah, we got all of it. I was saying you play the audio of that phone call with the FBI informant in your documentary, and with chilling accuracy, he pretty much calls out how a hit seems like it could go down with bringing up a high caliber rifle and several parts, being in a building that the Secret Service can't check all the buildings. He goes through pretty much all of it about a year or so before the actual assassination, correct?
Yeah, and of course the FBI had to have told Kennedy that he was being, there was a hit put on him. And so I think Kennedy took precautionary action against it, of which he had to do to protect his family. Because remember, the mob doesn't just come after you. The mob comes after your family also. So Kennedy had to be worried about, Jackie and the two kids and everything. So, and he wasn't acting alone. He was coming in as part of a operation. James Forrestal, his mentor, who was the first Secretary of Defense, he took Kennedy to Germany in 1945, and they examined all of the German high technology works that were going on, including the flying saucer factories. And all of this was taken back into America through Operation Paperclip, where German scientists were taken back into America to work on the space program. And so Kennedy was well aware that we had technologies that were much more advanced than they were letting on, and he wanted it out. And so in 1961, he said that he wanted NASA to go to the moon before the end of the decade, knowing full well that rockets could never do that, but that the technology they secretly had could do that. And so Kennedy's plea to NASA to get to the moon by the end of the decade, by the end of the 1960s, really upset the whole military-industrial establishment, which is exactly what Kennedy wanted. He wanted them to be upset because he wanted that technology to be released, thinking that they would have to show that technology in order to get to the moon. So hang on a second. Let me stop you right there. As we find ourselves up against a break, but I want to give people listening the money that you throw out here. So it sounds like what you're saying in this documentary is that JFK was not shot at Dealey Plaza. Is that correct? Yeah, I'm saying that he faked the assassination to get out of a for sure death by the mob. And
let's go over the details of that when we come back. We talk to documentary filmmaker Jay Weidner, who says that his film proves that JFK faked his own death. That is next on Coast to Coast AM. We're talking with documentary maker Jay Weidner. His new documentary is called JFK X, the real story, the killing of JFK. And right before we went to break, Jay dropped an explosion on this conspiracy theory, saying that you would have heard a 30 gauge rifle going off. Nobody heard that. There was actually no shots fired. And then he said he believes that Kennedy faked his death. So before we get into anything else, tell us about what you see on that video after you've enhanced it. What are you seeing that makes you feel like that was not a gunshot? That was special effects, movie special effects. You got my attention.
Well, yeah. Well, first off, I bring up a subject that no one ever talks about in the conspiracy world of Kennedy assassinations, and that is the fact that there's a splice in the Zapruder film, very obvious splice, right when the limousine goes behind the Stemmons freeway sign. There's an obvious splice, and it's kind of in a place where the car has disappeared for a brief moment, and just kind of an obvious place for the splice. The interesting thing about the splice is that the Warren Commission, which investigated the Kennedy assassination, used the Zapruder film as their timeline to figure out the events that occurred that day. But Time Life, which owned the Zapruder film, never told the Warren Commission that there was a splice in the Zapruder film. Now, most people will think, oh, what does that mean? Well, a splice is really important because it means that somebody's come in and physically changed the film. And
why would they do that?
Exactly. And why did they ever explain it? And why didn't they tell the Warren Commission? And why did they not admit it until 1967, 4 years later or 3 years later or whatever, after the assassination? And what's interesting is that if you watch the Zapruder film, before the splice, there's not a lot of people in Dealey Plaza, but there's maybe 100 or 150 people, which is surprisingly less than you would think. But after the splice, there's nobody. There's maybe 6 people.
That's true. I noticed that too. And it looks different. The coloring looks different when they come around the sign. So I've actually stood right there. When I first moved to Dallas, I actually stood right there It happened to be a very dark night, and for whatever reason, there were no modern cars on the street. So it was very eerie to stand in that same spot on what is the grassy knoll. Now that part of the street is actually blocked off, for whatever reason with concrete barriers, and you can't, just drive down it to recreate it. But it looks different. The film looks different when it comes after the splice happens. It almost looks like they used a different type of film.
They did. And so what they had in those days was that Abraham Zapruder, was shooting with Kodachrome film. And in those days, before digital, you had two types of Kodachrome. You had daylight Kodachrome and you had indoor Kodachrome. Daylight Kodachrome was tilted towards the red, and indoor Kodachrome was tilted towards the blue. And if you do an analysis of the film after the splice, you can see that it's tilted towards the blue. That would indicate that portion of the film had been put through an optical printer, and you would have to use indoor Kodachrome for an optical printer because it's using indoor light. So it indicates to me that film, after the splice, has been optically messed with. And how it's been messed with is that they used what in those days was called a traveling mat. In other words, they matted out the limousine, and then they blew up the background because the people in the background after the splice are actually bigger or as big as the people in the foreground, which is, in optics, is completely impossible. So the film was altered, and I'm not alone on this. Many, many film experts have said that the film was definitely altered after the splice and changed. And it was changed to hide the fact that there's all sorts of shenanigans going on that they don't want you to see.
Okay, so we have to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want you to lay out why you think this is basically special effects that really nobody, and even in filmmaking, really knew about back then. And let's get right to the heart of the fact that you feel like this was basically a big fake, a fake out, a fake assassination. So we will get back to that when we return on Coast to Coast AM. Rich Berra, Coast to Coast AM. I can tell you that you've sent shockwaves throughout the Coast to Coast control room. Everybody wants to get into this. Okay, Jay Weidner, let's talk about your enhanced Zapruder film, and what do you see that makes you think that no shots were fired, that JFK and possibly Jackie kind of engineered what looks like a special effects explosion? What's happening there?
So Kennedy, after the splice, the infamous splice, JFK, the limousine comes out from behind the freeway sign, which is conveniently blocking everything during the splice. And as he's coming out, his hand is doing a really curious thing. It's like reaching in to his jacket and pulling out something and placing it on the right side of his cheek. And you can clearly see in the enhanced version that there's something on his cheek. And so for about 2 seconds after they come out of the freeway sign, JFK has this blob on. That's what James Fetzer, the famous JFK researcher, calls it. He has this blob on his cheek. And this thing is there, and you can see it. It's casting a shadow in the noonday sun, and it's clearly there. And no one ever really talks about it except for a few researchers, but it's there. And then everyone in the car, curiously, everyone in the car, the driver, the guy next to the driver, John Connolly, Governor John Connolly, and his wife, all turn and look at JFK after the blob appears on his right cheek, and everyone is staring at him except for Jackie. And then Jackie comes around and does a very strange movement, and the very same blob explodes.
It looks like, in the video, it looks like she pulls a string. That's what it looks like.
She does. Yeah.
Oh, so that's what you saw.
Yes, and the film has been optically changed so that you can't see her doing that. And as soon as the blob explodes, everybody turns around and changes their positions and everything. JFK falls down into the well of the car, and then Jackie does something you would not expect anyone to do if bullets were flying past your head. She does not dive down into the car as everyone in the Trump rally did when the bullets started flying. She actually gets up and gets out of the car and crawls on the trunk and
she grabs something, right?
Yep, and then goes back down into the car, which is just completely not what you would do if bullets were flying around your head. Your instinct would be to dive downwards. So as a filmmaker, I looked at all this, and then as I show in the film, we show an interview with Governor John Connolly, and he claims that there was blood matter and brain matter all over the back trunk of the car, but in the enhanced version of the Zapruder film, you can clearly see there's no blood, brain matter, or anything anywhere. In fact, there's very little blood anywhere. We show also in the photograph, we also show in the documentary a photograph that a reporter took of the back seat of that limousine at Parkland Hospital in Dallas just about an hour after the assassination, and there's very little blood anywhere. And if you actually look at Jackie's dress after the assassination, I mean, it's like a nosebleed. There's nothing there hardly. So the question is, you get shot in the neck, and then you get where no blood comes out. Because in the Zapruder film that we show, when John F. Kennedy actually does not grab his neck, that is not what happens. What he does is he puts his hand near his neck, and he pulls out what we call the blob, which is actually a squib, and puts it on his right cheek. And then Jackie comes and she pulls the string and ignites the squib, which causes it to appear that John F. Kennedy has been shot by a bullet when actually he hasn't.
So in this scenario, boy, I know you're making the whole world explode right now. In this scenario, you would say that he faked his own death, but for eyewitnesses, not necessarily for a camera, because the camera would reveal the special effects. But do you think lots of people were in on it because there was no news cameras and they had somebody else to look for? They had Lee Harvey Oswald to look for. Do you think this was all plotted? And for what reason would he fake his death instead of just being defiant and beef up security?
Well, the reason that he faked it was because he was going to be assassinated. He knew it. And so he just got ahead of the game and decided to just do it in front of everybody. If you look at like interviews of Chicago mobsters and New York mobsters that come after the assassination, they all say that they don't know who did it. And that's just not how it works in the mob world. They know everything that goes on. I mean, there's gossip and everything. They know who hit who, why they did it. That's kind of the whole reason for hitting people. So that, you screw with me, I'm going to hit you, right? And so you want everyone to kind of know that you hit somebody. But no one really knows who hit Kennedy. They all say, oh, it might be this guy, it might be that guy, but no one really knows. And that's because Kennedy just got ahead of it using Hollywood special effects.
Okay,
and,
what about when he goes to the hospital? What about the doctors? What about autopsy photos of a president with his brain opened up? What about all that?
Well, that's actually the biggest evidence that I use to prove that this is all not real than anything else. Because if you look at the autopsy pictures of Kennedy at Bethesda Hospital, he doesn't even have a wound in the right side of his head. Yet the Zapruder film clearly shows him getting a gigantic wound on the right side of his head. But in the autopsy photos, there's nothing wrong with the right side of his head. So how can that be? And that is because the body that's being used in the autopsy is not the same body as JFK. And
so when that limo speeds off, when that limo speeds off, it doesn't go to Parkland Hospital, it goes somewhere else?
Well, David Lifton wrote a book called Best Evidence, and I had a lot of people challenge me on my theories here on JFK. And they say, "Oh, do you ever read Best Evidence? That proves that you're wrong." And I'm like, well, not really, because if you read the book Best Evidence by David Lifton, he interviews several people at the Bethesda Hospital in Washington, D.C., where Kennedy was taken, and they clearly say that there were two coffins delivered that day. One came through the back door like normal, which was the body that the autopsy was done on, and another one came through the front door, which is really abnormal. And several nurses and doctors say that they saw the second coffin come in. And this is David Lifton's best evidence that there's something going on here. And I'm saying, yeah, there is something going on. There were two bodies delivered to Bethesda that day. One was the body that was used in the autopsy, and the other one was a very alive JFK who was used by the Navy, because Bethesda is a naval hospital, to get him out into safety.
So then if this is, let's say this is true, would that mean that RFK, that was stage 2? Or maybe that was collateral damage? What do you think of that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are aspects of the RFK assassination that worry me, but I don't know. I think it might have been collateral damage. It was like the mob decided that since they did not really know who did JFK in, that they decided to stop RFK, who actually was the real enemy. If you actually look at the evidence, the guy who actually went after the mob like a bulldog, and I really gained a lot of respect for RFK, Robert F. Kennedy, in the making of the documentary, because, I mean, he really went after some serious criminal forces in this country. And I think, he's actually the one that caused all of this to happen. And I think his intentions were really good, but he just didn't know the viciousness of the people that he was dealing with. And so there's just so many strange things about the RFK assassination, that I don't know where to begin.
Yeah, it's tough, and it's really interesting when I hear you describe stuff. I mean, you've been in the movie business a long time, so you know all the effects, you know all the angles. That's why you can look at the moon video and say, "Hey, I know what they're doing there. That's what Stanley Kubrick did there, and he directed that. That makes sense." And when you look at this, you're like, "Well, there's no shots. There's no. This is a what I would call a die pack. What do you call it? Like an explosive pack that nobody's really seen before. But if you're trying to sell it to bystanders that are seeing it for 5 seconds, then you're going to have eyewitnesses everywhere. It makes sense. I guess I just have the question of, if he fakes his own death, then where does he go from there? Is he still, doing stuff with the Navy? Is he still trying to, bring down, foreign countries? Is he still going after Castro? What's he doing? And I mean, he's got to watch his wife marry somebody else. Like, that seems like he's got to watch his own funeral. That seems like a terrible existence.
Well, it's better than death. I think he probably went to Scorpio's Island, which was owned by Aristotle Onassis. Aristotle Onassis was the top financier of his 1960 presidential campaign. They were really good friends. His dad, Joseph Kennedy, was really good friends with Aristotle. They were both kind of mobsters running stuff and everything. And I think that they were kind of a bulwark against this mobster thing that happened. And I think Aristotle probably didn't really, have anything to do with Jackie, just married her. And then several people who live in Greece have contacted me since the movie JFKX came out, which is on Amazon Prime, by the way, and have told me that they worked for Aristotle and Onassis on Scorpios Island, and they said that there was a guy who looked like an elder JFK in a wheelchair that lived on the island for several years after the assassination, and that he liked to fish on the pier. And we know that Jackie moved to Scorpios Island with the kids, so he lived there. And yes, I think that JFK was retired off into Scorpios Island. And I want to say this. I think that, I know this is crazy. Everybody's like freaking out saying, oh, my God, this guy's nuts, and that JFK faked his death. But I got to tell you, once you get into these high-level areas, you can't get out. I mean, just ask Nancy Pelosi. She's got $190 million, and she can't get out. You can't get out.
Let's take your calls next. You've done a great job of laying out some pretty crazy stuff, but your evidence is pretty solid too. So let's dig in with Jay Weidner, the conspiracy theorist, if you will, filmmaker, JFKX on Amazon Prime. Your calls next, coming up on Coast to Coast AM. We are talking to Jay Weidner, documentary that is out on Amazon Prime right now called JFKX. He has just completely disrupted the whole entire universe of conspiracy theories by suggesting that Kennedy faked his own death. And I know we didn't talk about this yesterday, but it kind of hit me when we were talking. You've tied in Stanley Kubrick, Stephen King, and JFK. I was wondering, did you ever read that novel Stephen King wrote a few years back called 11/23/63 about the time machine, where somebody goes back and decides that if he can, the best thing he can do is go back to that year, and if it was actually Oswald, that he could take out Oswald and Kennedy could still be alive to this day. Have you read that book? Are you familiar with that book?
Oh, yeah. Following Stephen King's career has been a thing that I've tried to do. And I noticed that, what happens with these guys that are way up there at the top is they write a whole bunch of really super interesting books, and then sort of they become propagandists later in life. And it happens to filmmakers also. And I think that's what happened, although I thought that was actually a very interesting book.
It's a clever idea, and he talks about doing a ton of research and hiring a research team to really investigate it. And if I'm not incorrect, at the end of the book, he tells you that with all of his research, he believes that Oswald is the person who acted alone and got off the rifle shots and actually killed Kennedy, which is completely the directly opposite of what you've been suggested based on the film that you've seen, correct?
Yeah. Like I said, they later become propagandists because they're beholden to higher powers. And I believe Stephen King is one of those guys. I think the first part of his career was completely sincere, and then later it becomes, it happens to everybody when they get near the top. I don't want to get into that because I like Stephen King and have very many mutual friends between us, and I don't want to criticize him any more than that. But no,
it's an excellent book, though, right? Propaganda or not, it's a great book.
Oh yeah, it was a great book. And no, I don't believe Oswald was. I believe he was exactly what he described himself as, a patsy, and he knew it, and he was part of the operation. And there's only two murders in Dallas's history that have never had a forensic squad come to the murder scene and do an investigation.
And those are?
I don't know this. Yeah, those are Kennedy being shot at Dealey Plaza and Oswald being shot in the parking garage. So nobody ever came and did any forensics on Oswald being killed, and no one did any forensics at the site where Kennedy was killed. And that tells me more than I ever need to know.
Are you ready to take some phone calls here, Jay, and talk to your audience since you've laid all this out? Okay, let's take a breath, get a glass of water, reset, and we will do that when we come back on Coast to Coast AM. Rich Berra, Coast to Coast AM, our final hour of the show. We are lucky to have Jay Weidner on with us for 3 hours tonight. I knew it was going to take a long time to unpack, but now let's take some calls, and I want to get to the first-time caller line. Let's talk to Roger in Sacramento, California. Roger, I appreciate you hanging on and your patience. Welcome to Coast AM.
Thanks for taking my call. You know, the editor-in-chief of Time magazine admitted to being a member of the Communist Party during the McCarthy hearings. And if you examine the cryptography in the headlines of Time magazine a week before JFK was killed, the headlines read, "Something on the move, who's letting blood, Richard Nixon, so everybody's talking, the sound of footsteps, 10 stoplights, greatest jewel theft, danger professor at work, ambitious but in need of everything, colliding ambitions, total hostility, gentle but in charge of the firing squad, Meatball Kennedy, I've got a nice bashed-in face, M16 on the firing line, view from the street, Colt's new rifle, blockbuster and bust." Now, that suggests Richard Nixon had something to do with the assassination and that John Kennedy's block was busted for blockbuster and bust. Now, Stephen King, ironically, 17 years later, proves in the same cryptography to be the man seen getting John Lennon's last autograph.
That's right. You are not incorrect there. And you know what you're describing here, Roger? It sounds like you ever see that movie 3 Days at the Condor with Robert Redford?
That's a long time ago I saw it.
Where they kind of pour through newspapers and they pour through things looking for that type of thing. I think that'd be a great movie to redo now that, we have the internet. But Jay, chance to answer Roger's question, please.
Well, it's interesting because there's I think a lot of intelligence agencies were putting out all sorts of weird stuff right around the whole time of the assassination because they were intending to assassinate Kennedy. And so everything gets so obfuscated because of their, camouflaging intelligence that they're doing. And so we don't really understand what's going on until we really pull back and we realize that first off, Oswald killed 2 people in Dallas that day. He killed Kennedy, supposedly, and then he killed Officer James D. Tippit, who just happened to look exactly like Kennedy. And
then they call him JFK?
His nickname was JFK on the Dallas police force. So we have this incredible coincidence that Lee Harvey Oswald only killed 2 people, as far as we know, in his entire life, and he killed those people exactly on the same day, and they looked exactly alike. And we begin to wonder why that is. We also begin to wonder who called in the fact that Oswald was in the movie theater. How did the Dallas police know that he was in the movie theater? And all sorts of other questions begin coming in from there, right? And it gets weirder and weirder, believe me.
Well, I'm going to put you on the spot here since we talked about this on the phone a little bit as news was kind of coming out this week. And I said, when you talk about the whatever is happening at the top or whatever is happening behind the scenes, I said, can you tie that into what happened at the rally with Trump? And you kind of gave me some information that I haven't heard before about the caliber and the munitions experts and saying where that bullet might have actually come from. I haven't heard that on the news anywhere. Do you feel comfortable enough to share that?
Well, we know from the forensic sound analysis that there were 3 guns fired at the Trump assassination attempt. I believe it was 5 rounds, and then 3 rounds are different, and then there's 1 round. And the 1 round at the very end is, of course, the bullet from the Secret Service that shot the crooks on the roof. So there was rounds fired from the building that Crooks was on, and then there was rounds fired from another place, which I now believe is the water tower, and none of these places were ever surveyed or covered by the Secret Service. So the two highest places that were around Trump on that day were not even being covered or guarded by anyone. In fact, they were ordered. It looks like what's going on from what I'm hearing today is that there were actually orders from the Secret Service to not cover those places. But the problem with the entire Trump thing is that why would you ever be dumb enough to stage an assassination in a place where there's 10,000 cameras recording at the same time?
Yeah, it's a lot different now than it was at Dealey Plaza, yes?
Exactly. And these cameras are recording all of this stuff. So it's a very damning situation. I don't want to get into it because I don't have all the facts, but it's very damning. And it's not looking good for a lot of the agencies that work for the U.S. government.
I don't think you need to be a conspiracy theorist, but it is probably a good idea in this day and age to question the things that if it doesn't feel right, it's probably good to question it. Let's take some more phone calls here. Let's go to the wild card line. Steve in Albany, New York. Welcome to Coast to Coast.
Yeah, okay. To try and make it brief, who was the witness that saw Oswald shoot Kennedy? And this is pointed.
Well, there was a witness who claimed at first that he saw Oswald leaning out the window of the book depository firing the gun, but then he later rescinded his admission. So there's really not anyone who's ever said that they've actually seen Oswald firing. And I'd like to say this. I'd like to add this. While I was doing all the research, I tried to figure out why the Warren Commission thought that 3 shots had been fired, and the reason that they said that 3 shots had been fired was that a policeman on a motorcycle had left his radio on and recorded the entire thing, and that in that recording they heard 3 shots. So I got that recording, and I put it on my sound machine, and I couldn't see any spikes or anything, and I couldn't figure out why they thought that the 3 shots had been fired. And then I found a forensic evidence investigation by the FBI in 1980 of that same recording, and the FBI said there are no shots recorded on this recording.
No shots, not just 1, not just 2, but none.
None. No shots. And
interesting.
That's
so
from the FBI.
When you talk about that splice in the Zapruder film, which I've never heard anybody talk about that except for you, but you can clearly see it. You can clearly see something jump. Are you suggesting that maybe perhaps whatever happened the first time through, they went and shot again? Or what could be? Why does it look so different?
It could be. I mean, it really could be that they did multiple takes to make sure they got it right. That's in fact what I finally. As a film, okay, so my ballywick isn't like delving into like deep conspiracies and all that. My ballywick is that I'm a filmmaker and I look at films, film evidence of events, and then I analyze it. So I analyze the Apollo films and I tell you what I see, and then I analyze the Zapruder film and I tell you what I see. I analyze the photographs taken in the Kennedy assassination and tell you what I see. I analyze the other films that were taken and I tell you what I see. So as a filmmaker, I see things that you're not going to see as a regular person, and that's why what I do is kind of different than other researchers, because I'm not looking at it like a regular person. I'm looking at these things that are films that through the eyes of the filmmaker.
Yeah, I mean, you can see things that don't add up. I mean, when you show them as a non-filmmaker, just as a film watcher, you can definitely see colors change and horizons change and things that look uniform that shouldn't be in focus that are in focus. So when you explain, it's kind of interesting. You kind of get a little bit of film school along with in how to develop film along with your conspiracy theory documentaries here. I think it's really fascinating. And you certainly know your stuff, and you're not making any bold claims beyond what it is that you see. It's like, okay, well, if this doesn't add up, then this must not add up. So let's talk to Joe in Monterey, California on the wild card line. Joe, thanks for holding. Welcome to Coast AM.
Okay, so, you guys left me back there on the moon.
Well, we can still talk about the moon.
Okay, I'll do this briefly, and I want to get back to some things about the setup on the patsy that they had in JFK. Number one, the Saturn V, the F-1 rockets were not able to operate on 100% because they had something called the pogo effect. They could only operate at 50% thrust. The J-2 rockets were also very powerful, but they weren't powerful enough to lift the rocket all the way. So that's sad. And no stars in the sky. Anyway, back to JFK. If you look at the video when they brought out Lee Harvey Oswald, they had two men on both sides of him. They were five people with Harvey Oswald. They were walking abreast. I have never seen any law enforcement walk a suspect or a more than a suspect without them walking all around them, because somebody might shoot them. So that was a setup right then and there that they knew, and they were all in on it, on the murder of or the assassination of Lee Harvey Oswald. And yes, they changed the route of JFK to pass by the repository, and they were going, and they actually slowed down right there. That's why there was hardly anybody on the in the area photographing, because there wasn't anybody there because they didn't know the route. Thank you for taking my call, Rick.
You're welcome. Jay, what about the changing of the route? That's why there was nobody on the grassy knoll.
Well, I'd like to first off talk about, yes, that you would never walk a guy who was in the danger that Oswald was in with just two guys on each side walking abreast. You'd have somebody in the front, you'd have somebody in the back, and also the guys that are guarding Oswald are both military, ex-military guys that have been in combat, and there's just like almost no way that they would let a guy like Jack Ruby, who's kind of overweight and clearly obvious and not one of the people that should be there, like approach from the front with a gun and not do something. So the whole Oswald shooting, as in the movie JFKX we show, is completely and totally suspect. And again, one of the only murders that occurred in Dallas where there's never been a forensic investigation. They didn't even do blood samples. They didn't do tissue samples on the floor or anything. There was no investigation of the Oswald murder, and his autopsy was sketched. There was no photographs taken of the Oswald autopsy. Only a sketch.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
That's actually the first time I've ever seen him talk, is that kind of that interview questioning right when he first gets taken in. And that's, I guess, the last time anybody really heard him talk is right there, right? Where he's like, I don't know. I've been charged with the murder of an officer. I don't know what happened. He seems like he's sort of lost.
Well, he is. He doesn't really understand what's going on. And that was done on purpose. He didn't shoot either Tippit or Kennedy at all. They did a forensic search on his arms and his neck, looking for gunpowder residue, and there was none at all. So he couldn't have fired a gun. He couldn't have fired a rifle. He could have fired a handgun, but there was no residue even on his hand. So they knew that. Dallas police knew that night of November 22nd that he had not fired a gun that day.
The documentary is JFKX on Amazon Prime. Our guest, Jay Weidner, the final half hour of Coast to Coast AM coming up next. Well, we've been all over some odd kind of conversations tonight, talking about the the astrological effects of what was happening with that Microsoft outbreak and how the world's gone crazy. It is because of an alignment, a planetary alignment. And we've talked to Jay Weidner tonight, who's on the phone with us right now, who's got a documentary that just came out called JFKX. And we talked a little bit about that. And with the 55th anniversary of the moon landing, we talked about how he believes that Stanley Kubrick, the director who directed 2001 Space Odyssey, also filmed the footage that you see of the moon landing. He's not saying anybody didn't go to the moon. He's just saying the videos you see, that's not real. Or it's real, but it's a film made by Stanley Kubrick. And his evidence to all things is pretty interesting. Let's try to get a few phone calls in this last hour. Let's go to the wild card line. Michael in Burbank. Welcome to Coast AM.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you're right. John F. Kennedy was not killed in that car. If you've ever seen the pictures in Life magazine when JFK was in Hyannisport in the water, the ocean, with his little 2-year-old son, he was about 43 at the time. And if you look at his physique, he's a 43-year-old man. And I don't know if you've ever seen the autopsy pictures that finally came out on the slab where it shows supposedly JFK with his eyes open, and that's a younger man, much more fit, different hair pattern on his chest as Kennedy had in Hyannisport. So they know that Kennedy had Addison's disease really bad, and he was constantly going in to have medical treatments. He was in a wheelchair, and they said that he might not have even lived past 68. Well, because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, if Khrushchev would have known that Kennedy had cracked and he couldn't continue, they might have put those missiles back. So the whole fix was in with the family and Bobby Kennedy as the Attorney General, Johnson. They figured that if they made a hero out of him, a martyr, so that's why they didn't have the bubble on the roof. So they took out, I don't know if they took him out in Dealey Plaza, but they killed the double. And if you remember, the Secret Service was around that hospital for over a year and a half. That's before they could move, the sick Kennedy, the president, out. And they did move him to Scorpios. He was in a wheelchair, and the people would see the Kennedy families going out to the island on a launch. Very sad, with their glasses. And then after 68, nobody saw him. They said the fishermen went by and didn't see the fellow in the wheelchair. So that's when he died, and that's when she married Onassis. That was the payoff. But what they did was they took out the double, and he didn't know it was coming, but she did, because when they landed in Dallas, they gave her red roses, and the yellow rose of Texas is a Texas state flower. All dignitaries' wives are given a bundle of yellow roses. Well, when they handed her that bundle of red roses, that was a signal. She knew that they couldn't bring Kennedy out of it at the hospital, so the assassination of the double was going down. And that's basically what happened.
Comments on that, Jay?
Yeah, that pretty much is, I don't agree with everything, but I agree with a lot of it. And, I don't even know what to say. It's a very astute call there.
Yeah, people are doing their homework. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll round out the rest of the show with some more calls about Kubrick, the moon, Kennedy, what happened here last week. Jay's ready for it all. Coming up next on Coast to Coast AM. Hey, it's Rich Berra, your host for Coast to Coast AM tonight. Our guest, Jay Weidner, JFKX on Amazon Prime. No matter what you think about what went down, this is such an interesting documentary to watch. I've watched it twice, actually. I've been so sucked in and intrigued by it. I still don't know what I think. In fact, I think I want to ask Jay, what do you think the chances are that Kennedy was shot that day, now based on what you've discovered by watching that film?
0%.
0%?
Yeah.
Pretty big.
Yeah.
That's pretty high or pretty low. Okay, let's do some phone calls. We got a lot of people who want to talk to you. Let's go east of the Rockies. We haven't been there yet. Let's talk to Jim in New York. Welcome to Coast AM.
Hello. I just want to say the guest is brilliant. Kennedy faked his death, and so did his son. I psychically read it and doused it. I can still get energy readings on Kennedy's son, John. But my question is, there are many people whom I spoke to that were talking about the moon, that it's actually a biosphere and that there's a dome over the Earth, and we never really could have actually gone to the moon. Have you ever heard of anything about that we're in some kind of simulation?
Definitely, I've heard it, but let's hear Jay's thing.
Yeah, Nick Bostic, who's a top physicist, he, even postulates that we live in a simulation. And he said at one point that if you wanted to discover whether we are actually in a simulation or not, what we would do is that you would look into the past and see if there's any anomalous activity going on, because the programmers would have to spend less time programming the past than they would the present and the future. And so I took him up on that, and I looked into the past, and all I found was anomalies. So I'm not saying that we live in a simulation, but wow, there's a lot of evidence that points to the idea that we may be actually living in some kind of simulation.
I've heard Elon Musk say that it'd be hard to prove that we don't.
Exactly right. And there is just all sorts. I'm sure people are familiar with the Tartaria stuff and all of that. But you start looking into the past, you start finding there giant gaps in history and things that just don't make any sense. There's a Russian mathematician who, he when the software that the astronomy software first came out about 25 years ago, he decided to look into it, and he started discovering that, events in history were not matching the astronomy that was going on at the time, and he concluded that somebody was faking history.
Well, if that's true, we ought to be able to manipulate our future a little better, wouldn't you think?
We would, but we have outside forces which are dictating what happens in our future.
Fair enough. Let's go to the wild card line. It really wouldn't be a weekend show filling in for Coast to Coast for me if I didn't get a chance to say hello to Cornelius. In Alexandria, Louisiana, welcome to Coast, good sir.
Hey, Rich and Jay. I wanted to tell you something, Jay. My attorney was Richard B. Burns because the FBI set me up. I was a correctional officer at Oakdale 1, Louisiana. A lot of inmates write me and stuff because they're a captive audience. And also, Abraham W. Bolden Sr. wrote The Echo of Dealey Plaza. He was the first African-American Secret Service agent, and they set him up. He knew about the Kennedy assassination. But I believe the military and the mob and the intelligence agencies got rid of Kennedy. So I'm a little skeptical on your thing, but that was my take on it. And if you know Richard B. Burns, he worked directly with Big Jim Garrison on the Kennedy assassination, like the movie that you saw with JFK movie. So
Kevin Costner.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, well, actually, Jim Garrison and I actually exchanged letters back in the 80s and discussing the JFK assassination. He was quite perplexed by many things that happened in the JFK assassination. But, I mean, what I'm postulating, dude, is that that you're right, that the mob and intelligence were collaborating to get rid of JFK, and that JFK found this out through the FBI informant and realized that it was over for him, and that therefore he took actions, and I believe that people in naval intelligence assisted him to make sure that he escaped the operation. Because here's the thing. The whole reason that Kennedy was put in office was to find out what the CIA had been up to since their inception in 1947. The naval intelligence did not know what they were up to, and they sent Kennedy in to find out what happened. And he did find out. He found out that the CIA was in a marriage with the mob and that they were assassinating people inside the United States, which was outside of their charter, and he completely freaked out. And he said just a few months before the November 22nd, 1963, that he wanted to shatter the CIA into a million pieces. So clearly this is a war between naval intelligence and the CIA, with naval intelligence believing that they are the premier intelligence agency, as they were since the inception of the United States until the creation of the CIA. So there's this tension that's always been going on. And I'll end this with this. The guy that actually told and asked Trump to run for president in 2015 was Naval Intelligence Officer Steve Bannon.
Wow. Boy, you tied that all together. Let's go to Jim in British Columbia. You've been holding for a bit. Let's get to your call. Welcome to Coast AM. You're on with Jay Weidner.
Hi, Rich. Hi, Jay. Thank you very much for taking my call, you guys. And it's an honor and a privilege to speak with both of you. I just have a quick comment and a question, Jay. I just want to say God bless President Trump and all the Coast audience and his family. And I want to say, with your background, Jay, are you able to comment about the 1988 film that John Carpenter filmed, They Live, and what's forbidden, why you're not allowed to see that?
Well, it's one of my favorite films, and I'm a huge John Carpenter fan, and that's probably his greatest film. So if people don't know, in the film They Live, the protagonist discovers a pair of glasses that allows him to actually see beyond the veil, and he can see that there's a group of aliens that are taking over the earth, and they're using subliminal programming to control the human population. And, that may be very close to the truth, actually.
What do you say you're not allowed to see the movie? Is it not showing in certain countries?
No, I think you can see the movie. It's kind of suppressed, but it's still around, although it is odd that it isn't on like major, services.
Like somebody's not carrying it. That is surprising. Okay, let's talk to Stu in Pennsylvania, east of the Rockies. Welcome to Coast AM.
Hey, fellas, interesting program tonight. Not so sure I buy Jay's scenario. I had two personal experiences in my lifetime where I dated two gals that were directly connected to JFK's murder by their fathers. One of them played the part of JFK in the Warren Commission's car when they did the reenactment. And another one was head of a hospital, and he was tied in with Arlen Specter. So I was always interested in this JFK even when I was young. There's a couple questions I want to ask Jay, and he did not bring up the Hawkeye lab altering the film footage. And I have never, ever heard why Zapruder was allowed to be up on that high area with a camera. I mean, a camera could be easily turned into a weapon, and he would have the ideal place to shoot. Why was he allowed to be up on that high area, and what was the deal with the Hawkeye lab changing the film footage, which I believe the Secret Service was involved in that?
Here's the thing. Zapruder was a 33-degree Mason. The assassination took place at the 33rd degree latitude. There's a Freemasonic hall right there in Dealey Plaza, and it's very likely that Kennedy was a Freemason. So there's all this strange ritual, which a lot of researchers have uncovered, so I don't want to reiterate it, about what's going on that day. And Kennedy was part of they call his administration the Camelot, as if he was like King Arthur, and that would mean that Jackie was Guinevere. And, so is it the killing of the king ritual? Is it some kind of Freemasonic ritual that we're watching here? A reenactment of the killing of the king? And this is a typical in the Catholic Church. We have rituals, killing of the Pope. where the Pope isn't really killed. It's a reenactment of the killing of the Pope. And we have it also in Freemasonry, where there's the reenactment of the killing of the king. So there is a lot of weird ritualistic things that go on in the Kennedy assassination. For instance, the date, November 22nd, is right between Scorpio and Sagittarius, but it's also in the 13-month calendar. It's also the month of Ophiuchus, the time of the 13th sign of the zodiac, which is secret, hidden sign.
Oh, really?
That happens.
I've never heard that before.
Yeah, right on November 22nd, this occurs. So, I don't know if it was a reenactment, but I think it was. I think there was many things that were going on that day that are important that we don't quite understand, because the elite are using signals and rituals that us lesser mortals don't quite understand.
As a filmmaker, I was kind of wanting to get your take on this. How good was Stanley Kubrick at making films and getting messages or sliding them across? Because it seems like 2001 may be one of the best movies, if not the best movie of all time.
Yeah, he's the GOAT of filmmakers. There's no doubt about it. Everybody wants to be, every filmmaker after him wants to be Stanley Kubrick, James Cameron, Steven Spielberg. They've all said it. And, he took the boundaries of filmmaking beyond where anyone thought they could go. I was 15 years old and a confused kid, and I went to see 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it changed my whole life. I mean, I didn't know that you could even do those kinds of things at the time. And now filmmaking has gotten very sophisticated, and we can do things that we could never do before. But for his time and for his place, Stanley Kubrick's films still hold up all the way.
Yeah, they do. And he kind of lives the thing that you hear Gene Roddenberry say: if you want to get some truth out there, do it through art.
Yeah, and Kubrick was always embedding all of these odd things inside his films, which, researchers have spent, hundreds of hours, thousands of hours going over his films and discovering one Easter egg after another. Eyes Wide Shut, Full Metal Jacket, The Shining, 2001: A Space Odyssey, the Dr. Strangelove, Paths of Glory. They have all these little things embedded in them that are like so intellectually intriguing and so revealing. Everything from Dr. Strangelove with Peter Sellers, Dr. Strangelove saying that we need to build deep underground military bases to protect everybody, to aliens in telling humans how to become intelligent in 2001.
Amazing. Well, Jay, I want to thank you for being on the show. What a great guest you were. His documentary, JFKX, on Amazon Prime. Thank you for joining us tonight on Coast to Coast AM.